She was 19 and turned out of doors with almost nothing to her name. No family that would own her, no place to sleep past Tuesday, just a carpet bag, a folded blanket, a tin of pins that had been her grandmother's, and 3-pound coins tied into the corner of a handkerchief. And with those 3 pounds, Helen Reed bought the ruin of a small medieval castle on the edge of Grey Tor, a roofless shell and a rough stone keep that nobody in the parish had wanted for 40 years. But what nobody knew, and what she herself would not know until the 4th day of clearing the damp cellars below the keep, was that those cellars were not empty and had not been empty for a very long time. Settle in for this one, and before we go further, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Helen Reed had been born in the market town of Ashcombe in the year 1849, the only child of a linen draper who kept a narrow shop on the high street and a mother who died of a fever the winter Helen turned 6. She remembered her mother chiefly through the tin of pins, a small round tin of black japanned metal with a hinged lid and a painted violet on the top, which had sat on the mother's sewing table, and which had passed to Helen on the afternoon of the funeral. She kept it always in the pocket of her apron, and later in the pocket of her carpet bag, and by 19 she had opened and closed the little lid so many times that the paint of the violet had worn thin down one petal, showing the black beneath. Her father remarried within the year to a woman named Adela Wren, a widow from Bristol with 2 grown sons and a firm opinion of how a house ought to be run. Adela was not cruel in any way that would have shown to a neighbor, and she saw to it that Helen was clothed and fed and taught her letters, but she was a woman who kept her warmth for her own blood, and Helen grew up on the cool edge of the household, useful and quiet. She was set to work in the shop at 10, folding cambric and calico and counting out yards of black bombazine to widows. And she learned the trade well, and she learned also that she was not to expect anything beyond her keep. Her father, a mild man who had loved his first wife and had not the strength to love a second, agreed to whatever Adela arranged and rarely met his daughter's eye. The mentor of Helen's life was not her father and not her stepmother, but the cook and housekeeper who came to them from the age of Helen's 7th year, a widow named Martha Beek, 62 the day she arrived, wide as a barrel, with hands like river stones and a soft gray braid pinned twice around her head. Martha had lost a husband to a mill accident and 2 sons to a diphtheria winter, and she had come into service late in life because there was nothing else left to do, and she took to the small motherless girl in the linen draper's back kitchen without ever making a show of it. She taught Helen everything she knew, and she knew a great deal. She taught her how to bake bread with a poor oven and how to salt down a side of bacon and how to strip and rehang a chimney flue, how to mend a copper kettle with a lead patch, how to raise potatoes from parings in a bit of shaded ground, how to keep a still room with tansy and lavender and dried yarrow for a fever, how to sew a seam that would outlast the cloth, and how to read a household account and know at once where the money had gone. She taught her, above all, to look at things others had thrown aside, and see what remained useful in them. A cracked bowl held apple peel for the pigs. A worn coat lined a cot. A dry crust softened in milk became a supper. Nothing was to be despised that could still do work. Martha died in the summer of Helen's 17th year, quietly, in the small room over the scullery, with Helen sitting by the bed and reading psalms in a low voice, because Martha had asked for them, though she never went to church. She left Helen the tin of pins she had already given her long before, and a single sovereign wrapped in brown paper with the word "Keep" written on the outside in Martha's careful print, and a copy of Mrs. Rundle's cookery book with recipes underlined and margins full of penciled corrections in Martha's hand. Helen kept the sovereign sewn into the hem of her petticoat for 2 years and never spent it, though the winter of 1867 was thin, and there were weeks she went hungry rather than break the paper. The tin of pins she kept where she had always kept it, close against her ribs. Her father died in the autumn of her 19th year of a growth in the throat that came on quickly and finished him inside 3 months, and within a fortnight of the funeral, Adela Wren sent for the family solicitor and produced a will that left the shop, the rooms above it, and the whole of what small savings her father had put by, to Adela and to her 2 grown sons in 3 equal parts. Helen was named in a single line at the bottom, a sum of £5, and her mother's sewing chair, and nothing more. She did not weep in front of the solicitor, and she did not weep in front of Adela, and she asked only whether the sewing chair might be sent on when she had a place to send it to. And Adela said it might, though her face said otherwise. The solicitor, a man named Mr. Ainsworth of Ashcombe and Greytor, looked at Helen across his desk with a small tightening about the mouth that might have been pity or might have been embarrassment, and he told her plainly that there was nothing in law to be done, that the shop had never been in her father's sole name after the second marriage, and that she must make her own arrangements before the quarter's end. She was 19 years old, she had £5 and a sovereign in brown paper and a tin of pins with a worn violet on the lid. She had Mrs. Rundle's cookery book and Martha Beek's underlinings. She had a carpet bag and a folded blanket the color of oatmeal, and she had the whole of what Martha had taught her in 14 years of quiet kitchen mornings. She had also, printed in Mr. Ainsworth's own hand on a slip of paper he had passed across the desk almost as an afterthought, a note that a certain ruined property on the edge of Greytor was for sale by the parish for the sum of £3, being a stone keep and its cellars and the remains of a curtain wall on some 4 acres of neglected ground, and that no bidder had come forward in the 11 years since it had last been offered. She took the slip of paper without any change in her face, and she folded it once along its middle and once again along its length, and she put it into the pocket of her dress beside the tin of pins, and she said thank you to Mr. Ainsworth in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, but merely level, and she rose from the chair and walked out of the office into the grey September light of Ashcombe High Street. She had 4 days before the quarter's end, and she used them the way Martha Beek had taught her to use difficult days, which was slowly and one thing at a time. She went back to the rooms above the shop and she packed the carpet bag with what was hers and no more, which was 3 shifts and 2 petticoats and 1 grey wool day dress besides the one she stood in, a pair of darned stockings, a hairbrush with an ivory back that had been her mother's, the cookery book, the tin of pins, the folded oatmeal blanket, a pewter cup, a knife, a spoon, a small tin of salt and half a loaf of bread that Adela had not yet locked away. She sewed the £5 into the hem opposite the sovereign so that the weight would balance when she walked, and she did this by the window in the last of the daylight with the same small even stitches that Martha had drilled into her from the age of 7. She said goodbye to nobody in the house because there was nobody in the house who wished to be said goodbye to. And on the Tuesday morning she carried the bag down the narrow stairs at a little after 6, and she set it on the step of the shop and she pulled the door to behind her without looking back through the glass. Adela was still asleep upstairs, and the 2 grown sons were still asleep in what had been her father's room, and the shop smelled, as it had smelled all her life, of new cotton and starch and the faint tannic note of the black bombazine kept for widows, and Helen Reed, aged 19, stepped away from the smell of her whole childhood without any word at all. She walked as far as the market cross, and she stopped there and untied the corner of a clean handkerchief and counted out £3 coins into her palm, and she tied the handkerchief again and put it back into her pocket, and she went across the square to the parish office of Ashcombe and Greytor, where a clerk in a green coat took her £3 and wrote her name in a ledger under the heading of the disused property at Greytor, and gave her a folded paper that made her the owner of a stone keep, 4 acres, and the remnants of a curtain wall. He asked her, without looking up, whether she understood that the parish gave no warranty as to the condition of the fabric, and she said that she did. He asked her whether she wished a copy of the paper sent to Mr. Ainsworth, and she said that she did not. She put the folded paper into the same pocket as the tin of pins and Mr. Ainsworth's original slip, and she came out into the square again and the bells of street. Peters were ringing 8, and a milk cart was going past, and a woman she had known all her life crossed the far side of the square without meeting her eye, and Helen Reed understood, with a clarity that surprised her by being neither bitter nor frightened, that she was already no longer a person of Ashcombe, and that the business of Ashcombe would close over her going as a pond closes over a dropped stone, and this was, in its way, a kind of freedom. Greytor lay 11 miles to the northwest of Ashcombe by the coach road, and rather less than that by the field paths, and Helen chose the field paths because the coach fare was 1 and 6pence, and because she wished, on the first day of her new life, to walk out of the old one on her own feet. She left the market cross a little before 9 with the carpet bag in her right hand and the folded blanket rolled and strapped across her shoulders, and she went out past the tannery and the mill and the last of the terraces, and through the wicket gate into the first of the stubble fields, where the crows were already at work on what the reapers had left. The morning was gray and mild, with a wet undersmell of ditches and turned earth, and the hedgerows were heavy with hips and haws and the black knots of sloes, and she noted these as she passed, because Martha had taught her that a hedgerow in September is a larder if a person knows how to read one. She walked steadily, and she did not hurry, and she rested at the top of each hill for the count of 100 breaths, and she ate a piece of the bread at midday, sitting on a stone stile, with her back to a hawthorn that had grown up crooked out of the wall. She passed one village called Little Ordham, and she did not stop there. And she passed a keeper's cottage where a dog barked at her from a chain, and a woman looked out and looked back in. And she passed a plowing team on a long, low field, and the plowman raised a hand to her, and she raised one back. By 3 in the afternoon, the country had begun to change, the fields growing smaller and stonier, and the walls no longer laid hedges but dry stone. And the sky beyond the ridge had that particular pewter cast that belongs to open moor, and the wind, which had been at her back all morning, came round now onto her left cheek and carried a colder air with it. She smelt peat smoke before she saw the village of Grey Tor, and then she saw it, a scatter of grey slate roofs on the side of a long slow rise, with the church squarely in the middle and the parsonage beside it, and, above and to the north of the village, on the shoulder of the Tor itself, the thing she had come for, standing black against the paling sky. The shell of a small square keep of local stone, with the ragged line of a curtain wall running out from it and falling away, and the whole crouched among a tangle of bramble and elder that had grown up 30 years unchecked. She stopped in the lane at the bottom of the rise, and she looked up at it for a long time, and she shifted the carpet bag from her right hand to her left, and she said aloud, in a voice quiet enough that only the wind heard it, that it would do. Then she went on up the lane in the last of the daylight toward the place that was, from this hour forward, hers. The lane rose in a long, soft curve past the last cottage of Grey Tor village, and then narrowed to a cart track, and then to a footpath, and the footpath ran between 2 dry stone walls with grass growing high in the middle where no cart had passed in years, and at the end of the footpath there was a broken gate hanging on one hinge, and beyond the broken gate there was the ground she had bought. She stopped in the gateway and set down the carpet bag and looked. The 4 acres lay on the shoulder of the Tor in a rough triangle, bounded on the north by the remains of the curtain wall, on the south by the dry stone that had brought her up from the lane, and on the west by a fall of ground into a small, steep coombe where a thread of water showed silver among the rushes. The ground itself had gone to bracken and thistle and bramble, with 3 old apple trees near the keep leaning at odd angles and still bearing a scatter of small red fruit, and a patch of nettles taller than a man where a garden had once stood, and closer to the keep the low outline of what had been a kitchen yard, its cobbles showing through the moss in patches like the back of a great sleeping animal. The keep itself stood 4 square on a low natural rise of rock, and Helen walked around it once before she went in, counting her paces as Martha Beek had taught her to count any room she meant to work in. It was 18 paces on the south wall, and 18 on the north, and 16 on each of the shorter sides, built of the same grey local stone as the walls of the village, laid without much dressing, but laid true, with the courses running level and the corners squared with larger cornerstones that had been chiseled once and were now furred with grey lichen. The walls stood their full height on 3 sides, close to 30 feet, and on the 4th, the western, they had fallen inward at the top so that the wall walk showed like a broken tooth against the sky. There was no roof. The floors of the upper stories were gone, their beam holes plain in the inner walls, 3 courses of them, so that she could read the building like a diagram: ground floor, first floor, second floor, wall walk. The door was on the south side, arched, with the iron hinges still in the stone, though the door itself had rotted to nothing but a heap of black splinters on the threshold, and above the door a slit window with the remains of a stone hood. She stepped inside. The ground floor was a single room, floored with beaten earth and fallen stone and a thick mat of last year's leaves that the wind had driven in, and at the far end there was a stair, a spiral of stone treads winding up into the open air, worn concave in the middle of each tread by the feet of people 3 and 4 centuries gone. In the northeast corner she found what she had been looking for, a second stair, narrower, going down. She did not go down yet. She went first back out into the yard, and she gathered a bundle of dry bracken and a few of the drier bramble stems, and she made a rough torch and she lit it from the small tin of lucifer matches she carried in her carpet bag. Then she went to the head of the down stair with her torch held high, and she looked. The stair went down 12 steps, curving slightly to the right, and ended in a flagged passage. The passage was about 4 paces long and gave onto a low arched doorway, and beyond the arched doorway lay the cellars. There were 3 of them, she found, opening one into the next through arches of the same gray stone, each perhaps 10 paces by 8, vaulted overhead with a plain barrel of stone that had held these 30 years, and looked as if it would hold another 300. The floor was flagged, uneven, dished in places where the wet had worked, and along the walls ran low stone benches that had once served as shelving. The air smelt of cold stone and mushroom and the faint sweet sour of something organic that Helen could not at first place. She thought, standing there with her torch, that with a swept floor and a mended door and a stove for winter, these cellars alone would be a better shelter than many a cottage in the parish, and she set to work on them the next morning. She worked 3 days at clearing them. She swept out leaves and bat droppings and the shells of snails and the papery cases of old wasp nests, and she carried the sweepings up the stair and out into the yard in the pewter cup, because she had no bucket yet, and she scrubbed the flags with water from the coombe and a handful of sand and the corner of an old sacking she had found blown against the curtain wall. She slept those 3 nights in the ground floor of the keep, wrapped in the oatmeal blanket, with the tin of pins and Mrs. Rundle's cookery book beside her head and the sovereign still sewn in her petticoat. On the 4th day she came down the stair at first light with her torch and her sacking, and she began on the 3rd and innermost cellar, the one furthest from the door, which she had left for last because the smell there was strongest, and the flags most uneven, and something in her had said, without her quite hearing it, that this room would want the most attention. She was scrubbing along the base of the north wall of that innermost cellar, when the sacking caught on a stone that stood a little proud of its neighbors, and she stopped and looked and saw that it was not a flag at all but a wooden hatch, planked and pitched and fitted flush into the floor, with an iron ring set into it that had been rubbed bright at some point in the recent past. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the ring. She looked at the walls of the cellar, which she had thought empty. And she saw now, because she was looking for them, other small signs she had missed. A candle stub on a ledge, the wax still soft, a corner of the flagging swept cleaner than her own scrubbing had made it, a rope coiled behind a jutting stone, the faint scuff of a boot heel in the dust of the arch. She was, she understood then, not alone in the building she had bought, and she had not been alone since she came into it. She sat quite still for a slow count of 30. Then she stood, and she went back up the stair without hurry, and she fetched from the carpet bag the knife she used for bread, and she put it in the pocket of her apron, and she came down again, and she knelt by the hatch, and she took hold of the iron ring, and she lifted it. The hatch came up more easily than she had expected, hinged on the far side with 2 iron straps that had been oiled. Below the hatch was a short wooden ladder going down into a further chamber, a small vaulted space perhaps 6 feet by 8, and by the light of her torch, held down through the opening, Helen Reed saw what was in it. She saw casks. She saw 7 small oak casks, stood upright in a neat row against the far wall, each about the size of a butter firkin, and each stamped in black on the head, with a mark she did not know. She saw beside the casks a low shelf, and on the shelf a wooden box the size of a family Bible, brass-cornered, with a hasp but no lock. She saw, folded on top of the box, a square of oiled cloth. She saw, hanging from a peg driven into the mortar, a man's coat of dark blue cloth, and beside the coat a lantern with clean glass. and she saw, propped against the box on the shelf, a folded paper with her own name written on the outside of it in a hand she did not know, and beneath her name the single word, underlined once, read. She did not go down the ladder that first hour. She climbed back out of the inner cellar, sat on the top step of the stair with the folded paper in her lap, and read it by the plain light of the doorway. The hand was small and steady, and belonged, the paper told her, to one Josiah Penhale, cooper of the parish of Grey Tor, dead these 6 years, who had taken shelter in the cellars during a bad time, and had left what he left for whoever should next set foot in the place with an honest intention. He named the casks. 4 of French brandy landed at Polperro in 1859, and never claimed by the merchant who had contracted for them. 2 of Madeira, 1 of oil. He named the box, coin, in sovereigns and half-sovereigns, the sum of £182, put by across 11 years of a cooper's work and a widow's savings, his wife having died in the 5th year of their marriage. He asked, in a single line at the end, that whoever found it should use it to make the place fit again, and be kind to the 2 men who would come at Michaelmas to fetch the last of the casks, for they were his nephews, and honest, and knew nothing of the coin. Helen sat with the letter a long time. She folded it once along its middle and once along its length and put it in the pocket of her apron beside the tin of pins. Then she went back to work. She swept and she scrubbed and she carried her sweepings up the stair in the pewter cup, and she did not go down the ladder again that day. The nephews came on the 2nd Monday of October at dusk, with a covered cart and 2 led ponies, and they were startled to find a young woman with a lantern standing in the yard of the keep. She was Helen Reed, she told them, and she owned the ground now, and she had read their uncle's letter, and they might take what was theirs. The elder of the 2, a man of perhaps 30 called Robert Penhale, took off his cap and stood turning it in his hands and did not speak for a full minute. The younger, William Penhale, 24 and a wheelwright by trade, went down into the cellar with her and looked at the casks and at the coat on the peg and put his hand flat against the coat and left it there. They loaded 5 casks that night. The 2 of Madeira they left at Helen's asking for a payment of £3 10 shillings against the year's stores. They came back the next week with a load of dry oak boards from William's yard and a keg of nails and a bag of lime, and they would take no coin for the boards. They knew a slater at Trewin, they said, and a mason at Little Ordham, and they would send word. The slater was Amos Lydgate, 61, widowed, with a face like weathered leather and hands that had laid roofs on 3 parish churches. He came in the last week of October with his boy and a cart of slate, and he looked at the keep and said the western wall must come down 2 courses before anything else was done, or the whole would come down in its own time. He did the work himself, with the boy and with Helen carrying stone, and he charged her £4 for 6 days' labor and would not take more. The mason was Peter Halse, 48, a quiet man who spoke chiefly through his trowel, and he rebuilt the courses in 3 days with lime mortar mixed to his own recipe of 1 part lime to 2 of coarse sand and a handful of ox hair from a tanner in Ashcombe he still traded with. By the first week of November, the western wall stood true again to the height of the 2nd floor, and Helen had begun on the door of the south arch. She bought seasoned oak from William Penhale at cost and hung a door herself, using the old iron hinges cleaned in vinegar and wire brush, and she fitted a heavy oak bar in a bracket of Peter Halse's making. She slept now in the first cellar with the door of the keep barred above her, on a straw pallet laid on planks laid on bricks, with a small iron stove bought in Grey Tor for £1 12 shillings and its pipe let out through a slit window mended with tin. She cooked on the stove, and she washed at the coombe, and she wrote every shilling she spent in a small ruled book bought for 2pence at the village shop, and at the end of each week she counted what remained in the brass-cornered box and wrote the sum at the bottom of the page. The village came to her slowly and one at a time. Mrs. Ivy Truscott, 53, the vicar's housekeeper, walked up the lane one November morning with a basket of 2 brown loaves and a jar of damson jam, and said only that she had baked more than the vicarage could use, and left the basket on the step and went away. Helen returned the basket the next week with a pot of nettle soup made to Martha Beek's method, and a folded square of new hemmed linen. Mrs. Truscott sent word by the boy that the linen was better than any in the parish and that Helen might have work if she wanted it. Helen sent back word that she would. She sewed through December for the vicarage and for 2 farms beyond it, plain seams and mended shirts and turned collars, and she was paid in coin and in kind. A side of bacon from Farmer Henry Rouse, 46, of Higher Combe, and a sack of seed potatoes from his wife Bessie Rouse, 42, and a bundle of ash faggots for the stove from the woodman Tom Engove, 71, who had known Josiah Penhale, and who stood a long minute in the yard looking up at the mended wall, and said that Josiah would be pleased. She did not ask what he meant, and he did not say further. He came back every Friday through the winter with a bundle of wood on his back, and would take nothing but a cup of tea and a slice of bread with jam. In the 2nd week of December, Mr. Ainsworth came up from Ashcombe in a hired trap. He climbed the lane in his town boots and stood in the yard in his black coat and looked about him with an expression Helen could not quite read. He had come, he said, because word had reached him that the property at Grey Tor was being repaired, and that the buyer was the young Miss Reed to whom he had given the slip of paper in September, and he had wished to see for himself. Helen offered him tea in the first cellar, which was now whitewashed and had a rag rug on the flags, and a small square window led into the door of the keep above, and Mr. Ainsworth sat on a stool at her table and drank his tea and looked at her ledger when she put it in front of him. He said after a time that he had not expected it. He said that if she wished, he would file the deed and the boundary at the county office at his own cost, and that he had a client in Truro who bought Madeira. Helen said she would be obliged for both. He rose and put on his hat, and at the door he stopped and said that her father had been a mild man but not a fair one, and that he, Mr. Ainsworth, had not spoken as he ought to have spoken in September, and that he was sorry for it. Helen thanked him and closed the door and stood a moment in the cellar and then went back to her needle. The squire came at Christmas. He was Sir Edmund Trevanion, 67, of Trevanion Hall, 2 miles to the north, a widower with no children living, and he came riding up the lane on a grey cob with a groom behind him. He asked leave to see the keep, which he had known as a boy, and Helen gave it, and he walked through the ground floor and up the spiral stair to the wall walk, and stood a long time looking north across the moor. Coming down, he asked whether she meant to roof it, and she said in time, if the coin held. He said the parish had records of the keep going back to 1387, and that if she wished, he would have his steward copy them out for her. He said also that his tenant at Higher Field had a spare plough team in February and might be sent up to break the 4 acres for a spring sowing at no cost, as a matter between neighbors. Helen said she would be glad of the team and would pay the ploughman in Madeira if he liked it, and in coin if he did not. Sir Edmund laughed for the first time in a year, his groom said afterwards, and rode away down the lane in the cold blue afternoon. By Candlemas the village had a name for the place, and for her together. It was called the Keep, plainly, and she was called Miss Reed of the Keep, and children touched their caps to her in the lane. She kept the ground floor as a workroom now, with 2 long trestles for cutting cloth and a rack of shelves along the north wall for her stores of linen and thread and wool. The first cellar was her kitchen and sitting room, whitewashed and warm, with Mrs. Rundle's cookery book on a shelf above the stove and the tin of pins on the mantel beside a small brass candlestick. The second cellar was her still room, dry and cool, with bunches of tansy and lavender and yarrow hung from nails driven into the mortar and rows of stoneware jars along the stone bench. The third cellar was her larder, with the side of bacon hung in muslin and the sack of potatoes in a bin and a stone crock of salted beans. The inner chamber below the hatch she kept as it was, with the 2 casks of Madeira and the box, now emptied of most of its coin, and holding only Josiah Penhale's letter, folded, and the tin of pins beside it when she was working, and did not wish to carry it. She kept a Wednesday and a Saturday for sewing work brought up from the village, and a Monday for the vicarage, and the other days for the ground and the walls. In February the plough team came, 2 great chestnut horses driven by a ploughman called Jack Manier, 38, and he broke the 4 acres in 2 days and would take only a bottle of Madeira and a loaf of Helen's bread. In March she sowed potatoes in 1 acre and oats in another, and left 2 for pasture, and she bought 2 goats from Bessie Rose for 15 shillings, and named them Nothing, and milked them morning and evening. She made cheese by Martha Beek's method in a muslin bag hung from a beam, and she sold the surplus at the door for twopence a pound. Mrs. Truscott brought her a customer from the vicar's sister in Truro, who wanted a set of 6 linen shifts, sewn plain and strong, and Helen was paid £2 10 for the work and finished it in a fortnight. She kept small rituals. On Sunday morning she walked down to Street Peter's Inn Graytor for the service, in her grey wool dress with a clean collar and a black bonnet, and she sat in a pew halfway back and put a penny in the plate. On Sunday afternoon she wrote up her ledger and counted the coin in the box and put back what she had taken out for the week. On Wednesday evening Tom Angove came for his cup of tea and sat by the stove and spoke of Josiah Penhale in small pieces, the way he had laughed, the way he had made a barrel, the way he had grieved for his wife until his hand shook. On the first Sunday of each month, Robert and William Penhale rode over from Trewin for their dinner, and Helen cooked them a joint of mutton and potatoes and served them a glass of Madeira from what remained of their uncle's store, and they sat until dusk at her trestle in the ground floor, and left with their caps in their hands and thanks that were more felt than spoken. On a fair evening in May, Helen Reed sat on the wall walk of her keep with her back against the warm stone and looked down over 4 acres that were now green with young oats and hilled with potato ridges, and she counted, as Martha Beek had taught her to count any place she meant to hold. She was 20. She had come up the lane the previous September with a carpet bag and an oatmeal blanket and £3 coins tied in a handkerchief, and she had bought a ruin nobody in the parish had wanted for 40 years. On the mantel of the first cellar below her stood the tin of pins with the worn violet on its lid, black showing through the paint, where her mother's thumb and her own had passed 1,000 times, and beside it, taken up from the inner chamber and set there as a companion, lay Josiah Penhale's folded letter, weighted by the small brass candlestick. 2 objects from 2 strangers who had both loved someone they never got to see grow. Her mother, dead in the winter she was 6, and a cooper dead these 6 years, who had left his savings for whoever came honestly through his door. Helen thought of Martha Beek in the room above the scullery, of the sovereign wrapped in brown paper and marked, "Keep," and of the psalms read at a slow, steady pace beside a dying woman who had asked for nothing. She thought of Adela Wren, asleep upstairs on the Tuesday morning, of her 2 grown sons in her father's room, of Mr. Ainsworth, who had come in December with his hat in his hand and said he was sorry, of the woman in Ashcombe Square who had crossed to the far side, and of Sir Edmund Trevanion, who had stood on this wall walk at Christmas and looked north across the moor and called her Miss Reed. She thought of William Penhale's hand on his uncle's blue coat in the lamplight of the inner chamber. Below her, the goats moved in the pasture, and the coombe ran silver in the last light, and smoke went up straight from the pipe through the mended slit window. Helen Reed was 19, and turned out of doors with almost nothing. She had £3 to her name, and she spent them on the ruin of a small medieval castle on the edge of Graytor, and it was the best £3 she ever spent. If this story kept you company for a little while, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that a life can be built from what other people have left behind. Tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and light a small candle in your own way for the Marthas and the Josiahs of your life, the ones who loved you plainly and left you what they could. And ask yourself, before you close this page, what has been set down in your path that others called worthless, and what might you make of it if you took it up in both hands and began, quietly, to sweep the floor?